while everyone lined up for the same 5 blockbusters. The 90s were quietly making films that nobody noticed, and most people are still discovering now. These are those films, and they feature a director who rebuilt one of cinema's greatest set pieces after a terrorist attack destroyed his original location. A woman who performed her own underwater stunt in near-freezing water just to get the fear on her face right. And a factory full of real workers crying on camera because they were facing the exact same fate as the characters. Nicolas Cage witnessed a young man get shot during a ride-along with New York City paramedics while preparing for bringing out the dead, reached into the victim's mouth to clear his airway, and the man looked up and genuinely believed he had died and was hallucinating. That is either the most Nicolas Cage fact in existence, or a perfect description of what the film itself feels like to watch. Frank Pierce is a graveyard shift paramedic in Hell's Kitchen who hasn't saved a patient in months and is haunted by the ghosts of the ones he couldn't reach, slowly losing his grip on the line between the city and his own mind. Scorsese shoots the whole thing at night using distorted lenses and speed ramping that puts you inside the hallucinations of a man so sleep-deprived he can no longer tell the living from the dead. Cage plays Pierce not as a hero, but as a man desperately trying to get fired so he can finally sleep. The studio marketed it as a high-octane ambulance thriller anyway. Audiences felt tricked. And that is how a Scorsese and Paul Schrader reunion grossed $16 million on a $55 million budget and spent 20 years waiting to be reassessed. Shane Black sold the Long Kiss Goodnight script for $4 million in 1994, a world record at the time, and the weight of that number sat on the production like a debt nobody could pay off. Which is exactly what happened when the film opened with a press corps that had already decided what the story was. Samantha Kane is a suburban school teacher with amnesia who slowly realizes she is actually a top-tier CIA assassin, and the film is most alive in the scenes where her old identity bleeds back, uninvited, the cold professional efficiency surfacing inside a woman who just wants to pick up her daughter from school. Samuel L. Jackson plays Mitch Hennessy, the low-rent private investigator she hires to find her past, and Mitch was originally scripted to die in the finale. A test screening audience member shouted, "You can't kill Sam Jackson," and the entire room cheered loud enough that Harlan ordered re-edits that same night. Jackson has since called Mitch his favorite character he has ever played. Davis insisted on performing the underwater sequence herself in freezing water, and the shock on her face as she breaks through the surface is not a performance, which makes it all the more frustrating that the industry labeled the film a flop and the Harlan-Davis partnership did not survive the verdict. Shane Black's $4 million payday became the moment studios stopped paying record sums for original spec scripts and started buying franchises instead, which means a film about a woman rediscovering who she actually is accidentally ended the era where writers could still sell who they actually were. Al Pacino was in his 50s, sprinting across Grand Central Station platforms dozens of times for the climax of Carlito's Way. The physical exhaustion, visible on Carlito's face in those final moments, was not a directorial choice, but the accumulated toll of weeks of overnight shoots that the character happened to need. Carlito Brigante is a legendary drug kingpin who gets out of prison on a technicality and genuinely wants to go straight, saving $30,000 for a rental car business in the Bahamas, while every person from his old life keeps pulling him back toward the world he is trying to leave. The film's specific tragedy is that his loyalty to the wrong people is the only thing that makes him worth caring about. It is also the thing that gets him killed, and Pacino plays that contradiction with a weariness that feels less like acting and more like a man who has already seen the ending. De Palma had originally planned that climax at the World Trade Center, but the 1993 bombing forced a last-minute relocation to Grand Central Station. What he built there instead, a single chase through a closed terminal in the middle of the night, is now considered one of the greatest set pieces in cinema history, and came entirely out of necessity. Sean Penn stayed in character as the coke-addled lawyer throughout the shoot in a way that genuinely unnerved Pacino, which is a sentence that requires a moment to sit with given who Pacino is. Ben Stiller was still establishing himself as a film lead when David O. Russell cast him in Flirting with Disaster, and proceeded to rewrite scenes minutes before filming, scream at the cast to keep them in genuine agitation, and create a working environment so miserable that several cast members were reluctant to discuss it for years. What came out the other side was a performance so authentically frantic it launched Stiller's entire dramatic career. Mel Copland is a neurotic new father who refuses to name his baby until he finds his biological parents, and the cross-country road trip that follows involves mistaken identities, a bisexual ATF agent, and a New Mexico dinner party where Mel's brother tries to slip acid into Mel's food and accidentally doses a federal agent instead. That is either a comedy about the absurdity of identity or a very specific warning about accepting homemade food from strangers. Stiller plays Mel as a man so deep in his own head, he has lost the ability to act on anything without second-guessing it first. And the film is funniest in the scenes where the universe keeps dropping chaos in front of someone who genuinely cannot handle any of it. The acid trip sequence took 5 days in New Mexico heat. Russell's relentless direction created what Mary Tyler Moore later described as a situational psychosis, which is also a reasonable description of working with Russell on any given Tuesday. And her performance, throwing off decades of wholesome television persona, was a genuine shock to anyone who thought they knew what she could do. Miramax grossed $14.7 million on $14 million invested, and that return accidentally funded Good Will Hunting the following year. During a scene where Costner's character was supposed to be visible in the background, Costner stayed in his trailer, claiming he wasn't ready. Clint Eastwood grabbed a random extra, put him in Costner's shirt, filmed the scene, and told Costner when he finally emerged that they had already moved on, which is either the most Clint Eastwood response possible or a masterclass in managing difficult actors depending on your perspective. Kevin Costner was so associated with wholesome American heroism in 1993 that Eastwood cast him as a child kidnapper who commits cold-blooded murder, and when audiences refused to follow him there, the film earned $31 million domestically, while quietly making $102 million overseas, where critics called it a masterpiece of American existentialism. Butch Haynes escapes from a Texas prison and ends up on the road with a young boy named Philip, and what starts as a hostage situation slowly becomes something neither of them can name, with Butch giving the boy the childhood he never had while Eastwood's Texas Ranger closes in, carrying his own complicated history with the man he is hunting. Eastwood shoots the Texas landscape with a wide, unhurried patience that makes the road trip feel genuinely free for a while before the film slowly makes clear that both men on that highway are running out of road. Eastwood later said European audiences understood the film's ambiguity in ways American audiences didn't want to, and the $102 million they spent on it is the reason Mystic River and $1 Million Baby exist. Andy Garcia sat in on real New York City prosecution strategy meetings for weeks, preparing for nightfalls on Manhattan, became knowledgeable enough to correct the script's legal language on set, and by the time cameras rolled, the story felt less like fiction and more like a deposition he already knew the outcome of. Sean Casey is a former cop turned district attorney who wins a high-profile drug case and rises fast, then discovers the kingpin he just convicted was telling the truth about the police corruption that triggered the original shooting. The case that made his career is also the case that could destroy his father. Garcia plays that realization with the specific stillness of a man who has just understood that there is no version of the truth that leaves everyone intact, and the film earns that by spending real time on who Casey is before asking him to choose between his family and the law. Lumet shoots the courtroom sequences with a procedural intimacy that refuses to make the law look glamorous, and the film is most disturbing in the scenes where the dialogue stops and the characters just look at each other, because what people don't say in a room is usually the only true thing in it. The film grossed $10 million in 1997, and Lumet spent the next several years struggling to get projects funded, which is the kind of lesson Hollywood draws from numbers when it doesn't want to pay attention to the films. Wilson flew to Los Angeles with nothing resembling a plan, and Terrence Stamp plays him with the specific energy of someone who stopped caring about the odds a long time ago, which is either the most dangerous kind of grief or the most dangerous kind of man, depending on who you ask. Terry Valentine is a wealthy aging record producer who traded the working-class London they both came from for California money and California ease, and the film knows their confrontation is less about a murder and more about two men from the same place who ended up nowhere near each other. The director structures the Limey around Wilson's grief by cutting actual footage of a young Stamp from a 1967 British film into the present-day story as flashbacks. What that does on screen is genuinely startling. You watch 40 years pass on a single face without a cut, and the loss the film is built around suddenly becomes something you can see rather than just be told about. Stamp refused to soften his rhyming slang for American audiences. The director was terrified nobody would understand a word, and the solution was a fragmented nonlinear structure that turned what the studio saw as a liability into the film's most praised feature. The Big Sur finale was nearly relocated to a generic Los Angeles beach after a landslide closed the Pacific Coast Highway days before shooting. The director refused. The film made just over $3 million, and somehow that was enough to get him Aaron Brockovich. State of Grace opened 5 days before Goodfellas, grossed less than $2 million against a $10 million budget, and the director later said it felt like trying to sell a glass of water during a flood, which is accurate and does not capture how good the film actually is, and if you have seen both films back to back, you already know the comparison was never fair to begin with. Terry Noonan returns to Hell's Kitchen after a decade away and rejoins his childhood best friend Jackie Flannery and the Irish mob, and the film's specific cruelty is that Terry is an undercover cop, which means every scene where Jackie trusts him is also the scene where Terry is dismantling everything Jackie loves. Sean Penn plays that guilt with a twitchy, internalized dread that never lets you forget what he is doing, and the film is most uncomfortable in the scenes where Terry is simply present, drinking with people who would kill him if they knew the truth. Gary Oldman plays Jackie with a chaotic, barely contained energy that several cast members later suggested was not entirely manufactured, and the scene where Jackie burns down a local bar contains the kind of genuinely unhinged physical commitment that most actors spend entire careers trying to achieve once. Part of what makes it land is that the bar and the street around it are real, and the neighborhood is already dying. The film took nearly 20 years to be recognized as a peer to Goodfellas, which is the kind of reassessment that arrives too late to do the director any good, but confirms what anyone who actually watched it already knew. Michael Caine took a significant pay cut and a share of the back-end profits just to get A Shock to the System made, describing Graham Marshall as the darker brother of his character in Alfie, which is either a fascinating piece of self-analysis or a warning that nobody at the studio took seriously enough. Graham is an advertising executive who gets passed over for a promotion, accidentally pushes a panhandler in front of a subway train, realizes he can get away with it, and decides that murder is a more efficient approach to corporate advancement than patience. That sounds like a dark comedy premise until the film starts making you nod along. The director shoots the corporate world of early 90s Manhattan with a clean, fluorescent precision that makes Graham's murders feel less like crimes and more like performance reviews. What makes the satire land is that Graham remains charming throughout, never gives you a reason to stop liking him, and the film never once winks at the audience to reassure you that it knows what he is. The distributor went bankrupt shortly after release, and the film spent years in legal limbo, surviving only through bootleg VHS copies that circulated among cinephiles like contraband. A boutique label eventually rescued it, and it was immediately recognized as a cult classic. The irony of a film about corporate ruthlessness being killed by corporate bankruptcy is a piece of industry lore that Graham Marshall himself would have found grimly satisfying. The factory scenes and other people's money were filmed in an actual dying Connecticut plant, using real workers facing the same liquidation as the characters in the film, and the tears visible in the crowd during the speech about the importance of making things were not directed. They were the genuine reactions of people watching their livelihoods described on screen. Larry the Liquidator is a corporate raider who targets a debt-free but obsolete wire and cable company in Connecticut, going after it not because it is failing, but because its assets are worth more broken up than whole. That is a more honest description of how money actually works than most films are willing to put on screen. DeVito plays Larry with a big, sweaty, infectious energy that makes his greed feel almost life-affirming. And the film earns the complexity of the ending by making you genuinely like a man whose business model depends on destroying things that matter to other people. Danny DeVito gained nearly 20 pounds eating the donuts his character consumes on screen because he refused to use fake food or spit buckets and developed high blood pressure during the shoot, which is the kind of commitment that makes corporate ruthlessness look like a reasonable lifestyle choice. Wall Street Raiders have cited it as their guilty pleasure favorite for 30 years. Business schools use the proxy speeches as a masterclass in persuasion, and the film's prediction about the death of American manufacturing turned out to be less satire and more a fairly accurate schedule.